So again, for those of you that have been with us before, you would know who I am. But for those that might be joining the first time, my name is Tom Howard. I'm a board member here with Humane Kinect, and we've put together this initiative to share ideas in terms and education uh, in the realm of peer support, if you will. Uh, so tonight, we'll be talking about the importance of vulnerability as well as um, connection. And this isn't something I do too often. However, I really like this video. If nothing else, the guy's got a great accent. It just makes it a lot of fun. And it's really kind of interesting, and it's a really good overview on the importance of vulnerability. So let's just take 3 minutes and watch this. Are you guys getting any sound?
No sound on my end, Tom.
Not for me
How
either.
about now?
Nothing.
No.
All of us, but if they were exposed
There we
to
go.
Starting now.
unsympathetic critic would
Sorry
result
about
in
that.
severe humiliation and mockery.
It's not for me.
From close up, we are none of us reliably impressive. We get agitated, fretful, cantankerous, and panicky. Under the pressure of events, we shout, slam doors, and let out screams or wails. We have episodes of absurd clumsiness. We bump into doors, trip, and drop things down our front. We're worried pretty much all the time about how others see us, about where our careers are going, and about everything important that we've forgotten to do in our lives. We long for love, but are unthinking and insensitive around those close to us. We are gauche in our efforts to seduce and pitiful in our requests for attention. Our bodies have a range of shameful habits and vulnerabilities. We are, from certain angles, truly embarrassing propositions. All this we struggle to hide. The inner idiot is carefully monitored and ruthlessly gagged. We have learned from our earliest years that the only priority around vulnerability is to disguise it completely. We strive remorselessly to look composed, to erase the evidence of our silliness, and to try to appear a great deal more normal than we know we are. We are understandably very focused on the downsides of vulnerability. What is far less well recognized is vulnerability's occasional, very significant and profound upsides. There are moments when the revelation of weakness, far from being a catastrophe, is the only possible route to connection and respect. At points, we may dare to explain with rare frankness that we are afraid, that we are sometimes bad, and that we have done many silly things. And rather than appalling our companions, these revelations may serve to endear us to them, humanizing us in their eyes, and letting them feel that their own vulnerabilities have echoes in the lives of others. Together, we realize that the definition of what is normal has missed out on key aspects of our mutual reality. In other words, vulnerability can be a bedrock of friendship. Friendship properly understood not just or primarily as a process of admiration, but as an exchange of sympathy and consolation for the troublesome business of being alive. There can, of course, be unfortunate ways of handling vulnerability, when we do so in the form of an aggressive demand that others rescue us, or when our frailties lack boundaries, or when we're close to rage and hysteria rather than melancholy or grief. Good vulnerability doesn't expect another person to solve all our difficulties. We let them see a tricky part of who we are, simply in the hope that they will be emboldened to feel more at ease with their own less dignified sides. Good vulnerability is fundamentally generous. It takes the first step at disclosure so as to render it safe for others to unburden themselves and disclose something of their hidden selves in turn. It's a gift in the form of a risk taken for somebody else. Furthermore, displays of vulnerability have a curious way of signaling that we are, despite the embarrassing avowals, far from fundamentally ridiculous or pitiful. We are rather strong enough to be weak, to let our silliness, our idiocy, our anger, and our sadness show, confident that these do not have to be the final verdicts on who we are. We proceed with a bold sense that despite the lack of surface evidence, everyone is in the end as wounded, aggrieved, worried, and damaged as we are, and that we're not therefore, through our disclosures, casting ourselves out of the clan for good. We are simply reconfirming our essential membership of the human race. It's something of a minor tragedy that we should spend so much of our lives striving to hide our weakness, when it is in fact only upon the dignified sharing of vulnerability that true friendship and love can arise. We love bringing you these.
So, what is vulnerability? Openness to susceptibility to or openness or susceptibility to attack or harm. I like to open with that one because, I mean, at its extreme form, that is leaving yourself vulnerable, right? But more in tune to what we're talking about, it's a willingness to show emotion or to allow one's weakness to be known, willingness to risk being emotionally hurt. So it's this opening of yourself, right? And of course, after I read those, a show of hands, who wants to go first, right? The first thing you want to do is go, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. Who wants to get hurt, right? And that's always the trouble with when it comes to uh vulnerability is determining what is the right level, and we'll talk about that. So why does this matter, right? And I've got a few quotes here that I'd like to look at because I think it kind of helps uh, summarize a little bit when we talk about being vulnerable. How can you be seen when you're armored up with your entire life, and what people see is what you want to put out there? I think that last line is probably the one that really draws me to this is well, what people see is what we put out there, right? We saw that in the video. I loved how in the video they showed where he had like that embarrassing picture and he wanted to untag himself and get rid of it. Especially the way we function today, so much of our life is wrapped up in social media. And we see everybody at their best angle. Even now, I remember being shocked the first time I realized that I could take a picture of myself and I could hit some buttons and make myself look thinner. Like, wait, who does that? And then the reality is a lot of people are doing that on social media. But when we look at it, all we think is that that's all we see of people's lives, and we think that that's it. The fact is that if they take that armor down that you see on social media, they are, as the video said, just as wounded and aggrieved as we are. Everybody has a lot of crap going on. Just because it looks good doesn't mean that it is. Some parts maybe, but like all of us, we all have struggles. Vulnerability is the birthplace of connection and the path to the feeling of worthiness. Like that is huge because we spend a lot of our time armoring up. I really like that phrase, being armored up, especially as a first responder. We armor ourselves up emotionally all the time, and as much as I do it, well, if you're in law enforcement, I can't imagine how you ever take that armor off. But I also know that people do that going into the office. Uh, if we could see a show of hands, like everybody would raise their hand if I was to go, hey, who's had a really awful boss? Right? All of us have lived through that. Some of us are probably currently living through that. So again, we armor ourselves up in a self-defense, and that becomes our new go-to. And we're afraid to do this vulnerability because what's important about the vulnerability being the birthplace of connection is the opposite of that is disconnection. People heal from their pain when they have an authentic connection with another human being. That's where healing takes place. Emotional healing takes place not in a vacuum, but with other people that you connect with and that care about you and you care about them. That's where this healing truly happens. So vulnerability is an emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, or emotional, oh, I gotta move the box, emotional exposure. And, so what does that look like, right? We'll talk a little bit about what emotional exposure looks like and how to gauge that. Um, the response, because we're afraid of vulnerability, we opt out of vital conversations just because we fear looking wrong or saying something wrong or being wrong. Ultimately, we fear being judged. And again, that can get very tricky, especially on the job if you have coworkers or a boss that's just not um I wouldn't say your friend, but not in your team, right? If you're having someone that's really unhealthy, it can become very dangerous to be vulnerable. And that concept of the fact that we opt out of vital conversations is important because I really do value that human connection. And oftentimes, think about how many opportunities you missed to connect with someone that could have been really amazing, but you opted out because you were afraid of saying the wrong thing or looking wrong, right? So I would encourage you to start thinking about um, those places in your life where you're holding back. The courage to be vulnerable is not about winning or losing. It's about the courage to show up when you can't predict or control the outcome. And I highlighted control there because, again, so many of us try to control every aspect of our lives. And the issue that you're going to have if you take that first step in being vulnerable is you don't have control anymore. You can't control, you might assume, you think, you're maybe they'll respond this way, but you can't control how other people are going to respond when you're vulnerable. So vulnerability is important because effective conversation is about the unpredictable and uncontrollable art of connection. I like to like when it comes to listening skills, we'll talk about this some more, but when it comes to like vulnerability and connection and conversation, I, I like to think of those as being a dance. Um, I remember probably, well, I won't date well, okay, I'll do it. It had to be 30 years ago now. I took dance lessons and, and I remember we'd partner up with different people and y- there were some people that honestly, I don't know how either my toes or their toes came out of it okay. It was just awful. And then there's other people. I remember one in particular. Uh, we started dancing. It was like and I can't dance. Let me just say that I didn't get a lot out of the lessons, but like we could instantly connect, and we were like synced together. It was crazy, and that's that uncontrollable art of connection. And it's the same way when it comes to communicating and connecting with another human on an emotional level by using vulnerability. You'll feel once you start to be vulnerable. We watch body language. Again, I don't want to go too far into listening, but you're watching for all those verbal and nonverbal cues, and you go, this dance is I'm stepping on toes here, and you're going to back up, right? But again, it's unpredictable, but you have to be able to take that first step. So rather than risk exposing our vulnerability, and having a needed conversation, we spend an unreasonable amount of time managing problematic behaviors. Um, and I think that when this is out of from Brene, a lot of this area here is from Brene Brown. I highly encourage you. Daring Greatly was a good read. Most of her books are really phenomenal. But we think about that problematic employee or coworker, or how about a family member that we don't have conversations with because we don't want to open ourselves up to that risk. And in the end, we just manage problematic behaviors that usually just tend to eat at us. And then finally, I think I've made this point, hopefully, connection is made through vulnerability. The opposite of connection through vulnerability is diminishing trust. And that's really important. think about as we move forward here, we'll talk about work family stuff, but think about that fact that if you're unable or unwilling to be vulnerable, you're going to have diminishing trust. It's not just that things stay status quo. Things actually start that trust and the communication and the connection all start to disconnect. And I don't know about you, think about different times in your life and maybe with family or coworkers. In my head, like I can think of some coworkers that maybe were like after a while rubbing me wrong. So like, you know what, I'm not even gonna be open to this person. And what happens is it actually you can feel that division over time becoming greater and greater. So 6 myths of vulnerability. First of all, vulnerability is weakness. That's definitely a myth. It definitely takes a lot of strength to be willing to open yourself up to that challenge, right? That to let go of the control that we like in our lives every minute of every day, to let go of that to be vulnerable actually takes a lot of strength. Myth number 2, you don't do vulnerability. Well, e- every day we walk out the door of our house and we open ourselves to any kind of unknown risk, right? Going to the store is an unknown risk. We do vulnerability in many different ways. Now we do a pretty good job of guarding ourselves, especially emotionally, and sometimes that's called for depending on your situation. But to say you don't do vulnerability is just not true. You can go it alone. This pushes against everything we know about human neurobiology. We are hardwired for connection, and we'll get to connection in the next section here. Myth number 4, you can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability. No, you can't. It's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to be uncertain. It'll be the best thing you ever did, but it'll also be very uncomfortable. Trust comes before vulnerability. That absolutely is not true. In order to build trust, again, if we go back to our video, the the opening process of trust is vulnerability. It allows someone that's already hurting an opportunity to trust you just a little bit. Think about when we're thinking about this in the realm of peer support. If we have someone that's in a place where they're in pain or hurting or emotionally struggling, it's it's not valuable for us to come in like the knight in shining out armor, right? Like we talked about that last week. What is peer support? Peer support is a dual effort between two people. It's a learning and growing opportunity for both participants. So the first thing you need to do if you have someone that you believe could benefit from peer support is to show that first opportunity or that first crack of, hey, look, I'm going to pop off my armor a little bit if you want to take yours off. And now let's just be vulnerable a little bit here, right? So we'll get to, and this is where this is important. The vulnerability is disclosure. Yes. However, um, we have to we have to scale that. I remember I was doing a training with a group of firefighters, and we're all in this class. None of us really know each other, and I've had people share some stories that I couldn't even imagine sharing, right? But this was a safe space that was created just for that purpose. What I tell when I'm teaching, what I tell people is that doesn't mean, that safe classroom setting where everybody's like-minded, we're all on the same page, we're all here for the same thing. We've begin to build a little bit of trust. Maybe you can share on a scale of 6 to maybe even 8, depending on your comfort level. So the more open and the more you share is a 10, and the less you share is a 1. So honestly, here on a Zoom, I don't know who's going to be watching this. It's going to end up on YouTube forever. I'm not going to an 8, right? I'm going to share it. I'm going to share. I'm willing to be open. That's part of what I do, right? But I could share up to a 4, maybe even a 5 in some instances on an open meeting. But if you're dealing one-on-one with someone, what I suggest is start at a 1 or 2. We have to be careful what we share because even though we want to help, we need to make sure that that person is healthy enough to receive our support and that they're worthy of what we share. Just because we want to help doesn't mean everybody's worthy of what we have to share. It's this is again, well, like I said, it's a dance. I'll give you a little bit, you give me a little bit, and then we grow in that. Does that make sense on the scale of 1 to 10? Because it's I've watched people do this and I've watched them like jump in at the 8 and I'm like, oh, what are you doing? Like I'm not gonna share what you just said, but I don't know the other 25 people in this room. You might want to dial that back just a little bit. The other thing that I would also kind of talk a little bit about when we talk about that vulnerability scale is if you jump in at an 8, you may actually scare the other person off. Like that might be more than they're ready to take. Like they just need to know that you're open because they have a burden to share. And if you jump in at an 8, they're going to be like, oh, I can't even, I can't carry this right now. I can't carry what I'm carrying. I can't carry what you just gave me. So again, just pay attention to how you share. Start at that 1 or 2 and let them share. If you feel like they're still looking for more trust building exercises, you can share a little bit more. But only if you feel like you're in that space that's safe with them. And again, I would probably caution you that if this is your first interaction with this person, you don't know them, don't share anything too deep that you're not willing to have get out. You may not want it to get out, but if it does, you don't want it out there that, if you're working with a coworker and you're like, man, I would do anything to choke out my boss right now because he's such an a-hole. Well, then this guy goes back and tells the boss, hey, man, Tom thinks you're an a-hole. Like, oh, that's not what So again, think about what you're sharing and on the level you're sharing, and then let that trust grow. So, can you be vulnerable at work? What are some barriers to being vulnerable in the workplace? Right? I think I just shared one. Like one of the barriers could be, I don't know if I can trust this other person. Other barriers could be, and I see this in the fire service a lot, and I'm sure it's out there in the corporate world as well. If if I go and I share with my coworker, and now 2 years from now, let's say I was dealing with some alcohol issues or trouble marriage, what you name it, right? Now 2 years later, the guy that I shared it with got promoted up to being a boss, and now it's my turn for a promotion, and he knows my history, and he's the one reviewing whether or not I get a promotion. So that can be a definite setback to peer support and being vulnerable in the workplace. You have to know that who you're being vulnerable with is truly a safe person to bring that to. Now for us, most departments now have peer support teams where you're safe to go within that, but we also offer an avenue to go outside of our area with people we don't know. And again, Humane Connects .org, what a great place to do that because you can get connected with people that don't know you and you don't know them. And so again, in the workplace, we just like we were talking, you have to be vulnerable first to create that safe place for others. And honestly, like when I'm teaching other fire departments, a lot of them will be talking like, well, I don't know if guys here will ever trust me or will they be willing to talk? And I'm like, well, you're going to take a 2-day class and go back and probably not, right? You just took a class. You have to create that space wherever you are, whatever your job is, whether you're a plumber, if you're in a corporate world, a first responder, if you're part of a mom's group, you have to be that one that's willing to be a little bit vulnerable in the group, first of all. Second of all, you got to be trustworthy, right? Create that safe space for others. So that's really about being vulnerable in the workplace. can you be vulnerable at home? I got to be honest. I'm plugging away, putting all this together last week, and I had the work one, and I moved on, and I'm like, wait a second, you know, being vulnerable at work can be tricky, sure. What about being vulnerable at home? Yeah, that I can tell you that can get tricky. Um, I'll offer a little layer of onion. I'll move up on the scale a little bit. I am happily married, but it's my second marriage. My first one, it was not safe to be vulnerable at home. I learned that pretty quick. I couldn't bring things home. Some things I could, others I couldn't because they'd get turned around and used against me later, and it was just craziness. That's probably a webinar for another day. But again, this is important to really think about. Can you be vulnerable at home, and what are those barriers, right? First of all, if you are in that place where you cannot be vulnerable at home, you have to take steps to change for you, your spouse, your significant other, whatever your situation is, your kids, you have to take steps. First step is couples counseling. Well, actually, I'll back that up. First step is individual counseling, and then connected to that would be couples counseling. Again, humaneconnect.org is a great place if you're looking for resources, ideas, or if you need help. Humane Connect it's a great place to really at least get that ball started. So counseling, and then just a big shout out to John Gottman on YouTube. He's got so many videos that are so good. He is. I'll sit and watch anything he puts out in videos. He's got a older 4-part series talking about the intricacies of relationships. Because it's really interesting. One of the things I'll share real quick that I learned from him was he talks about how predictable human behavior is. It's actually very predictable. So he said, well, when we started, we thought, well, if we put two people together, it should be twice as predictable. Unfortunately, when you put two people together, it's completely unpredictable. But he did find some things that are predictable, some behaviors that are he does, I think it's the 4 horsemen of a relationship, and it's all good stuff. Even if you don't have to worry about being vulnerable at home, I encourage you to check out John Gottman on YouTube. And then the 5 love languages by Gary Chapman. That's was my wife and I's one of our favorites. Too often we think that, for example, one of the gifts, there's gifts. I'm not going to remember all 5, but I know one of them is gifts. One of them is encouragement, I believe. One of them is physical touch. And one, yeah, I got 3. That's not bad. I got 3 out of 5.
Acts of service,
Oh, there you go.
and I don't know the fifth. I'm trying to
All
think.
right. Well, we're doing good. We got 4. So, but I really like that book because oftentimes we think that whatever our love language is also the love language of the other, right? So I love when my wife just touches my hand. I'm like, oh, I just feel it feels good, right? Just sit in the car, right? So I would think that if I touch her hand, she's like, yeah, but maybe it's not. I'm not going to get into what our stuff is, but again, having those conversations, and these are some simple things you can do to get started. But again, I really encourage you if you struggle at home with vulnerability and not feeling emotionally safe, you have to take some steps for your own mental health to make that right. So, all right, here's another layer of onion, but it's not really on the high on the scale. But I like making my own memes, so I made both of these actually. So the question is, can you allow others to be vulnerable? Right? Like oftentimes it's like we talked about last week, asking someone if they're okay, and then they say they're not, and you're like, oh, oh, the moment you ask if they're okay, then out of fear, change the subject to, oh no, well, anyways. Right? Or the moments you have to those cane and they respond no, and you're like, ooh, oh, look at the time, right? So that's important for you to think about. Like when we talked about doing peer support and having that time to listen, what are some barriers allowing others to be vulnerable with you? Are you a person that maybe maybe you're too preoccupied. Maybe you're just like, ADHD and you're all over the place and you've never really, you do fine at work, but maybe you haven't really sat down with people for them to go, oh, I want to talk to you for a minute, right? So think about that a little bit about how willing and open you are with others that you work with. And then I included that one that we must suspend judgment. When it comes to others being vulnerable and making that connection, uh, this seems like, oh, of course. But I'm telling you, it's hard. It can be hard, right? Some people, it's no big deal. Like but there's other people's, especially when it comes to people in the workplace that maybe they don't have a lifestyle like you do. Maybe they believe different things. Maybe you name it, right? It can be really hard to go, ooh, I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable with this person, see where it goes, and see if I can help. You have to be able to just kind of go, you know what? This is another human being. I'm going to let them speak and just let it ride, and we'll just see where this goes. And be open to it. Again, it might be the best dance you ever had. You don't know till you try. So, connection, in the end, connection is what we all desire. Psychologically, we have this drive in our brains for connection. And I don't know if does anybody recognize that picture it's from Ghostbusters? Remember, he'd hold up the sign, he kept zapping the guy, and so to kind of give this example of how psychologically we have a drive for connection. There was an electric shock study, which sounds horrific and probably ancient, but it really wasn't. It was probably within the last 40 years. So what they did is they got, of course, the willing college student for 20 bucks. They wire up his brain to watch his activity, and they set him up on his hands to get an electric shock. He knows he's going to get this. He doesn't know what it's going to be. Well, as the amps up and just as they give him the shock, they measure his brain activity. And of course, as you might imagine, it was off the charts, right? I'm about to get an electrical shock. It's like testing your 9-volt battery. You do it, but you're like, oh, every time. Well, then they repeated the same study with the same people, but they were allowed to bring one person in with them. And it cut their brain activity in less than half by having someone there with them. Again, everything else was the same, but it's that drive for connection that makes everything go better. So then, of course, sociologically, by nature, we're pack animals, right? There's very few people that wander on their own. Our long ancestors created tribes, and they were even limited to their size depending on food and that. And then as we grew and technology grew, our tribes grew bigger and bigger to where now we got these crazy big cities, right? But we're just by our nature, we're called to be together. Are there some outliers on that? Yeah, there's a few outliers that, the lone wolves, if you will. But for the most part, we're all driven to be together. And then, of course, theologically, we were not meant to be alone. Right in the beginning, I will make a helper for him. So human connection in the end is something that all of us have a desire for. I thought this was a good list. What is not connection? Or what connection is not, rather? It's not perfect. I know we so often think that we are, but none of us are perfect, right? Sometimes human connection is difficult. Sometimes there's miscommunication. So it's not perfect. Doesn't mean you give up. We keep going. Not digital. I in fact do not have 400 and some odd friends, even though Facebook tells me that, right? Um, not what I would say is that there can be a time and a place for that, and it's nice to stay connected with people I knew in high school and see their kids and all that stuff, but that's not a true connection. A true connection is someone that you're sitting down face to face, you're having a phone conversation. It's an actual real life connection, not just tagging pictures. It's not one-sided. Connection just is not one-sided. Again, when we think about that dance, what does it look like if only one person's doing the dance? It looks silly. And it's not really a dance. It's not an exchange of information. You know, I have some people that I work with that we are connected, if you will, by the job, and we exchange information, but we're not really connected. They don't know about my kids. They don't know about my struggles. I don't know about theirs. And that's a bad thing. I mean, I work with 110 people. I can't be that connected to everybody. So, but again, that isn't a true connection. A true connection is really knowing that person, and both you knowing them and them knowing you. So trauma causes separation, but why? And before I go too far with this, trauma is kind of a blanket statement for, when we talked last week about the order, disorder, reorder, that disorder piece, that causes separation in our lives because it turns things upside down. And so trauma could be, it could be a childhood trauma. It could be you saw a wreck on the way home. Trauma could be, I think my boss is going to fire me tomorrow. There's all kinds of different traumas, and that's a pretty blanket statement. So, uh, but how does this cause separation? It causes separation because we're afraid of saying anything. We're afraid of showing that vulnerability in the moment. We're afraid of showing any fear or weakness. Secondly, we don't trust people with our story or experience. And then lastly, others are unable to relate. You know, sometimes that may be true, but I think by and large, if you take time to explain what's going on in your life, most people can relate to other people because, well, that's what they call the human condition, right? There- A lot of the trauma that I've dealt with in my life is very obviously career specific. So I get it. There are parts of it. However, there's also a lot of things that I've dealt with that anybody listening to this webinar could go, yeah, you know what, I've been there. Yeah, I raised two kids. Yeah, it was difficult. Yeah, they were difficult. I went through a divorce. That was hard, right? So the last thing I don't think I have it on here. Um, the last thing that causes that separation is when we're going through any type of emotional, physical pain, our brains tell us that we're the only ones dealing with that. Nobody else is dealing with this. I'm the only one, you know, and I can't tell you like how many times I've started conversations at work and said, "Hey man, XYZ happened and you know that kind of bothered me." And then someone else is, you can see the look on it like, "Oh, yeah, you know that bothered me too." So again, don't think that, you know, the human condition doesn't happen in a silo. All of us are going through these things together. So be willing to, again, start at the scale, a one or two, but be willing to open up on that. And then finally, emotional separation affects the brain the same as physical pain. Uh, Emotional separation hurts. It really hurts. And again, our brain sees that the same way as physical pain. And I'm not encouraging anybody to do this, but I read a study a good 5 years ago, and it looked at people that were dealing with emotional pain taking Tylenol, and that it said that it helped their pain, right? Like Tylenol that we take for backaches and all these other things is actually helpful for physical or emotional pain as well, but only because our brain sees that in the same way. And then finally, alcohol numbs the brain center that desires connection. It's no secret. Unfortunately, alcohol has been kind of a mainstay in the fire service for many years. Um, that has changed in just my 30 years. Where we started and where we are is two different places, and I'm so happy about that. However, I know that the public at large also their number one self-medicating tool is alcohol. Had a rough day, gonna pour myself something over the rocks, right? Had a rough day, gonna crack a beer. And I'm not anti-alcohol. I don't really drink myself. But I'll one every now and then I may have one if I'm so inclined. But for me, it's always it's a matter of the heart. Why do I want a beer? Well, because there's one in particular, a stout, a milk stout that I actually like that, right? I can't imagine I would ever drink a light beer because I don't like how it tastes, right? But the important part of this is that the fact that if you're using alcohol to kind of chill out, if you will, after a tough day, what happens is alcohol goes to the same brain center that desires connection and numbs that out. So now, if you've had a bad day, you're sitting there by yourself, you're feeling like crap, and you're like, I'm just going to have a beer. Well, that goes to the brain center, and suddenly maybe you don't feel like crap anymore. And, I was kind of thinking I should call my buddy, but you know what? Nah, I'm good. And the reason this is so dangerous is because the next time this happens, it's not like you consciously go, wow, the last time I felt like this, I decided to have a beer and felt better. No, your brain instinctively goes, just have a beer, it'll feel better. And it does, right? Now, this is not an addiction presentation, but I think we all know where this goes. One beer turns to two, turns to six, turns to I don't want to put my recycle bin out on Wednesday because if it tips over, my street's going to get filled with wine bottles and cans, right? So again, I just caution you, if you want to have a beer, have a beer, but remember, think about your intention in having that. So how do we make connections? Make time, right? I know we all got busy lives and we all got a ton of things to do. And trust me, I raised some kids, so I get it. There are those chapters in life where making time to go hang with a buddy is a dreamland, right? But again, you're not going to make connections unless you make time. Be open to listening to others. Think about that when even if you're not necessarily meeting someone in a peer support realm, if you're meeting with a buddy, think about it. Be cognizant that you offer them time to share what's going on in their lives. Ask people, hey, what's going on with you? Where are you at? What's been new? What are you doing? Right? Again, that suspension of judgment. Because as soon as we start judging others, we really are creating a division because we're not listening to them anymore. We've already made up our mind about XYZ. And so we don't need to connect anymore because we've made a determination. So you really need to suspend your judgment in the conversation. Be okay with who they are. They might be a lot different than you and me, right? But that's okay. That's who they are. As long as they're not hurting anybody or hurting themselves or doing anything illegal, you're good. You might learn something too. Be open about who you are. Yeah, don't beat yourself up on these things. Um, be open. We'll do I don't know if it'll be next one or not, but we'll definitely do it on listening skills. Um, be open about who you are. Know the baggage you bring in there. Um, but also know that I think we used the quote last week. Uh, for I am merely human, nothing human is foreign to me. Be okay with who you are. Remember, to be heard is to be made whole. Deep inside, we all have this longing to be understood. With that, any questions on vulnerability in connections?
Tom, when you were talking, great presentation. Thank you for really good information. I really liked how, if we're not vulnerable, you talked about how that can actually diminish our trust with others. And I've seen that in my own life. You had a lot of other great points. I did want to ask you, in terms of what you said is not vulnerable. You said, you know, social media or the digital world isn't connecting with that isn't really the type of connection we're needing. How do you feel about AI? AI is rolling out and there's different types of support, software support through AI that's being rolled out right now. I'm curious myself as to the effectiveness of people getting that connection they need out of it. But I'm also skeptical at the same time. I just wanted your opinion on that.
Well, I think like all things, I think, this whole AI thing is all at once amazing and scary as hell. Um, could someone get help from using some type of AI feature? Well, maybe. Um, but boy, without having that true human instinct and connection, like that just, what do we need connection for if we got AI, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's already started, right? Like you got AI girlfriends and boyfriends and, so now we don't need each other. No, no, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. There's no way that any computer can out human another human.
Yeah. That makes sense, and I have a similar perspective and opinion to that. As far as with you talking about how alcohol can actually numb the area in the brain that needs connection, would that also extend to um other substances like marijuana or drugs in general, any intoxicant?
That I can't speak specifically to that. I don't know. I do know alcohol does. It's my feeling that actually if you were to open up and are you familiar with the addiction tree?
No.
The addiction tree is I love I love the addiction tree because uh the addiction tree shows that all addiction is rooted in trauma, shame, and pride. And then as the branches go up, I can sit here and tell you that, well, I don't really drink, so I don't have addictions. However, there's another branch that includes working, exercise, and just basic busyness. It's activity addictions. And so my feeling on this, without being a doctor, is that actually what happens is when we crave that loneliness, we can fall into an addictive state, right? Like have you ever, I'll admit it, I've been on Instagram, started floating through some reels. Next thing you know, what I thought was a few minutes was a half hour, right? And somewhere in my brain, it just disconnected from everything. I didn't care if my wife was home or if I was at work and someone was in the room, I was gone. So I kind of have this feeling that maybe addictive behavior goes to that brain center. But I'm going to ask. I'll talk to my friend Dr. Christy McInnes and see what she says on that because I can't say that for fact.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen.